Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us here. I see some people are still creeping into the back rows as we start. So let's get going, and we're going to talk today about looking into the future. So I've called this Seeing into the Future. So I'm going to share with you some of the tools that we use as futurists to understand more about our future. Now, nobody can give you certainty, but if you have a little bit more clarity and confidence about the future, it helps you make better and more well-informed decisions now. So this is very much for you if you're a leader at any level of your organization, to understand more about the future so you can navigate yourself and your team through that future, through some uncertainty, but also with clarity and confidence. So I know there are some people who've been to my presentations before, and there are some new names and faces here as well. So let me go through my three broad rules of engagement first that I use for all my presentations. So the first one is I'd like to give you some things to think about here. So do the best that you can to avoid any distractions or interruptions for the hour that we've got together, and lean into this. So do be playful. If you're here live, there's going to be an opportunity for you to ask me questions in the chat, so feel free to do that all the way through, but also I'll ask you some questions and ask you to engage as well. If you're watching the recording, hello there, you don't get the benefit of the live interaction, but I'm sure you'll still get some value from this presentation. And yes, I'm recording it, and I'll send the recording out to everybody who registers, so don't feel that you have to be frantically taking notes as well. But when we get to the interactive exercises, I invite you to take part. And the most important thing is I want to give you some things that you can take away and put into action immediately. So this presentation, this hour that we've got together, is kind of a cut down version of a leadership program that I run, but I'm not going to try and compress it all like a 2-day program into an hour. What I've done is I've picked specific bits that you can actually take away and use immediately. So I really want you to get some things of value that you can use. Okay, so let's find out where everyone is. I'm going to do a bit of a Where's Wally here. So let me show you this map here. And I know most people here looking at the registrations are from Australia, New Zealand and the region. So can you please just type in the chat where you're from? Your city, your state or your country, whatever you'd like to do. And we'll just see where people are. Right, so mostly around Australia, but actually all around Australia, which is great to see. Good, excellent. All right, so people all around the country, which is really good to see. Okay, fantastic, because we'll talk about things that are relevant for you wherever you are, but particularly, because I'm in Australia as well, it'll have an Australian focus to it as well. So I want to, before we get into this whole process of seeing into the future, I want to tell you a story about something that happened in my life about 10 years ago now. So I live about 200 meters from a big community park, which is also a dog park, Britannia Reserve. And I remember around about that time, 9 or 10 years ago, we used to take a Cocker Spaniel, Jessie, for a run in this park. And it's a multi-use park. And by the way, Jessie is no longer with our family, but we've got 2 other Cocker Spaniels in our family. This is Harley and Jasper. But I remember at the time when we took Jessie for a run in this park, because it's a multi-use park, my local council, in their wisdom, has divided the park into 2 areas. So I've zoomed in to there's signs all around the park, and I've zoomed into this area here. So you can see there that they've delegated the bottom half of the park, the south part of the park, the blue area, where you can let your dog off the leash, so we could let her run around the park. And the red area at the top of the park, you have to have your dog on the leash. So as I said, there's signs all around the park, and the only problem is between the blue area and the red area, there's no fence, there's no gate, and Jessie can't read. So we let her off in the blue area, and of course she runs all over the park. And I remember thinking, even at that time, 9 or 10 years ago, this is exactly what disruption's like. that the dogs are off their leash and we can't bring them back under control or wish that there were gates and fences. And even for us in a country girt by sea, which has protected us for many decades, it's something that now we're in a very connected world, and things that are happening elsewhere are going to have an impact on us. And this is exactly why we need to be seeing into the future and having a broader lens than perhaps we would have, needed in the past. This idea of seeing into the future and understanding future planning and future scenarios is all part of a bigger conversation around the future of work. And the future of work has 4 broad elements. You see a lot of conversation about that now. Let me simplify it for you and give you the 4 key elements that I reckon we should be considering. So the first one is about understanding what's coming up in the future, so we know what work needs to be done. That's what we're going to talk about mostly today. Then it's about making sure that you attract the right people to do the work for you, and attract and nurture those people, and the right people, whether that's permanent staff or contract or bringing people in on Zoom meetings, whatever it is, making sure that you've got the right talent. The next area is about humans and machines working together, either humans and robots, or as we know now, increasingly humans and AI. So it's augmenting humans. And the last area is having a culture where people are open to change and even embracing change, and are willing to be adaptable and flexible, rather than just assuming that what worked in the past is going to continue to work in the future. So if you look at those 4 elements as the future of work, today we're really going to focus on this one here, about understanding what work's coming up in the future. Okay, so I've got another question for you. I said this will be interactive. So here's another question about something that's happened in real life. And I'm going to ask you to type in the chat I'll explain this, and I'll ask you to type in the chat what you think the answer to this is. So the question is, what do these 4 companies have in common? Okay, so the first one is Groupon, which is the marketing and promotions company. There are others in Australia, like Scoopon's still quite big. The next one is Slack. So Slack is like office messaging system. Microsoft Office with Teams now does a lot of what Slack does. And the third one is Uber, which is ride sharing and other services. And the last one is WhatsApp. So many of us know WhatsApp as its messaging tool, like a worldwide messaging tool. So in a couple of words, what do you think these 4 companies have in common? And by the way, there's more than one right answer. So whatever you think, just a word or 2 or a short phrase, what do you think those 4 companies have in common? Okay, born by the internet, they're online, digital, communication, disruption. Good. I'm loving the responses here. Strong online system. So online seems to be a really big thing, which is true. These companies are seeking a percentage. They've disrupted. Yeah. Yeah, minimal overheads, like Uber is the largest taxi service in the world, but they have no vehicles themselves. Okay, good. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate you sharing that. So all of those answers are true. There's one other thing that's common with all those 4 companies, and that is that they were founded during the GFC, during the global financial crisis. So you'd think that at a time of crisis, it's a really courageous thing, it's a brave thing to do to start a company. But actually, in some ways, it's easier to start a company because the crisis has done a lot of the disruption for you. So instead of you trying to disrupt established players and trying to get people to think differently, in a crisis or in times of uncertainty and change, people are looking for alternatives. They're assessing whether what they've got now is good enough, and So these companies that came in at a time of great disruption were able to gain a foothold because people were already looking for different options. And of course, now we're still going through lots of change and uncertainty. It's not the global financial crisis anymore. It's not COVID. It may be AI, but there are a whole bunch of other things that are happening in the world that mean that the established order is being shaken. And that means that if you are working for one of the established organizations, then you might be a little bit more vulnerable than you would be otherwise, which is again why it's really important for us to understand what's coming up in the future. So, as I said, I run this program called Future Scenarios, and it's normally, it can go from anything from a half-day program to a 2-day program. And broadly, we look at 3 things here. So the first part of it is looking broadly. So doing a scan to see what's happening in the world and what might be just around the corner or over the horizon. So to identify some scenarios that might have an effect on us. The next stage is then narrowing it down to choose the ones that are going to be most important for us in the short, medium, and long term. And the third one is then how do you use that and put it into our either implementation plan now or a strategic plan for the short and medium term future. So, as I said, I'm not going to try and compress everything that I do in the program into an hour, but I'm going to give you some really valuable tools in each of these areas so that you can take this away and actually start using it straight away. And of course, if you want to engage me to help you with that with your leadership team, happy to do that as well. So a theme for this, I like this quotation from Tolkien, from The Hobbit. And he says this, that if you are doing your strategic planning and there's some live dragons somewhere around the corner, you should include them in your planning. So you can kind of paraphrase it a little bit, but this is the whole point of this process, to be looking at the dragons that are coming up in our future and seeing them as opportunities or seeing them as threats and seeing how we can manage them. And some of the dragons are ones that you can see and predict and others that you can't see. That's why I said in the future of work, that fourth area of being adaptability and having a culture of change is so important, because there's some things that we can't predict. But today, I'm going to show you how to predict, or at least get some idea of what might be plausible for your future. Okay, so let's start with this first area. The first area, and I think this is the most important and often the most overlooked, it's understanding what external influences are going to affect us. And if you don't get this right, or if you don't identify the right things, then it doesn't matter what you narrow down and act on, because you've actually missed the really important things. Let me just mute everyone here. Yes. Okay, so if you don't get this right, then you miss the opportunity to then narrow it down and figure out what's actually going to go into your plans. Okay, so this is the most important one. By the way, when I asked people beforehand, if you registered, you might have got an email from me saying what's the biggest challenge that you're facing, and I'm really grateful for that, because we've got some really good responses here, and I've woven some of these into the presentation today. So I'm going to kind of keep them semi-anonymous, but I'll share with you some of them. So here's one from Charles, and he says the biggest challenges are all the uncertainty in the markets, stupid conflicts that are ongoing, the current occupant of the White House. You never know what's coming next. Okay, and that is true. But there are some things that you can do to have a better idea of what's coming. Here's another one. This is again, this is from Rebecca. Again, I've kind of anonymized her exact comment, but it's saying, look, as a CEO, and she's a CEO of the organization, I can easily understand certain things, and she was talking about operational things, and understand how that's going to be disrupted. But what about the markets facing part of our sector? Okay, and you might be in a position like that as well, depending on your level of leadership in your organization, you might be responsible for a number of different departments and sections, or you might be responsible for only one. And even if you're responsible for only one, you might identify things that are relevant for your peers and colleagues as well. So just keep that in mind as we go through it. But if you're responsible for a particular area, then today can I encourage you to just focus on that area to get some ideas. Okay, so just a little bit of history. We won't spend a long time on this, but this whole idea of scenario planning started about 50 years ago when the senior leadership at Shell, they looked at what was happening in the world and they realized that there was some uncertainty in the world. So if you think about 50 years ago, the 70s and 80s, there were things like what if Jimmy Carter becomes president of the USA? What if there's war in the Middle East? What if the OPEC countries restrict the supply of oil? So as leaders, they said, we don't know what's going to happen, so let's find out. So what they did was they took 3 guys and put them in a room for 6 months and said, go and do all the research, find out what's likely to happen in the future, and then come back and report to us. And they did. So they spent their time, they came back with a number of scenarios and how likely they are, and the management said, this is fantastic, which of them is going to happen? And these 3 guys said, no, that's not the way it works. We've given you some plausible scenarios. Make sure you factor them into your plans. So that's how that whole process of scenario planning was born. Now, there are some reasons why, and it's a really valuable process, but there are reasons why we can't use that process anymore exactly the way that it was done. Okay, so I'm going to ask you in a minute to type in the chat why that process is flawed. Okay, so let me give you a couple of examples. So one is they had 6 months to do it. Okay, we just don't have the luxury now of having 6 months to do that. Here's another reason. It was all blokes. All right, so now, of course, we need to leverage the diversity and the unique perspectives of lots of different people because they all have insights that can help us in our planning. And here's the other one. Another one is that they didn't have any accountability. So they did the work, then they handballed it to the senior leadership and they said, okay, it's off our hands now. But increasingly, all of us as leaders and in our role, whatever our role in the organization, we're responsible for understanding about the future. We can't just send it off to a scenario planning team. Okay, what are some other reasons? So we've said too long, absolutely, so that's one. What else? Type in the chat why else that process is not the same process we'd follow now. Yep, so exponential increase in the number of variables, and similarly the world's more connected, absolutely. Yep, and we don't know, so it's harder to plan for scenarios in the future. Melissa, there's ongoing recalibration. Yeah, some of the disruptors, Rebecca, are definitely less predictable than they were at the time. So again, we're seeing common things here. The world's changing far faster as well. Okay, thank you, everyone. Here's another thing that's happened, of course. Oh, okay, we've got more. So you're saying unknown unknowns. And it's an ongoing, and exactly right, Julie, it's an ongoing process, right? As opposed to do it once, put it into your plan, and then forget about it for years. Okay, and I've specifically asked you to identify flaws in the process and why we wouldn't do it that way. But of course, there's some positives as well, like the positives in the way that we can do scenario planning now. And one of them is, of course, with AI. So it's interesting. I'll tell you briefly about a client I'm working with their leadership team, and this is the 4th year that I'm working with them. And just look at the way that AI has influenced the process of that program. Not only the impact of AI on the organization, but even doing the scenario planning. So the first time we did this, which was 3 years ago in 2022, early in the year, before ChatGPT, we couldn't use AI in the program. Now, we definitely talked about the coming impact of AI, because AI has been around for a long time, but we couldn't use any AI in the program. Then the next year, so 2 years ago, ChatGPT was out, and but the organization was very wary about the employees using it, so they weren't allowed to use it, but they let me demonstrate during the program how you could use ChatGPT for their planning. Last year, the employees were allowed to use it because they had a new policy and they were allowed to use it. So all the way through the program, when they were working away, they didn't just talk to people at their tables or do Google research. They were able to use, they were using Copilot. They were able to use that to help build richer and more plausible scenarios all the way through the program. And this year, when they did it, I got them to even do some pre-work and do some extensive research, which I coached them through. So when they came to the program, they'd done a lot of this scanning already, so that we didn't have to spend what used to be the first half day of the 2-day program doing all this environmental scanning. We could work together in the room on the research they'd already done. So even your process of planning is going to keep changing. Before we finish today, I'm going to give you some examples of how you can use this. You can use AI for scenario planning. In fact, let me just quickly just get a feel in the room here. Can I just ask you, if you are using AI for your future planning, can you just type yes in the chat? I'm just curious to see how many people are already doing it. Okay, so there's quite a few already in the room. Okay, so if you're not, I'll give you a couple of hints on how to do it. Okay, and we'll do a live demo with AI to be able to show you a couple of ways of doing that right now, if you want to, in the chat. And before we do that, I've got a little bit of a fun little exercise here. It's not scientific in any way, but what I want you to do is I'm going to give you 10 things that are happening in the world, and I'd just like you to think about and rate yourself on how many of them you know about. So for every one of them that I go through briefly, if you've heard of it, just give yourself a little mental tick. Don't type anything in the chat yet. At the end of the 10, then I'll ask you to just give yourself a score and type that in the chat. Okay, so don't type anything in the chat just yet, but let me go through them and just give yourself a score as we go along. Okay, and I'll try to do this fairly quickly. This is not scientific. It's not all the most important stuff happening in the world, but there are things that are happening, and I'm just curious to know, like in the room, how much do we know about them? Okay, so let's go. Okay, the first one here is Iceland. Most employees in Iceland now work a 4-day work week. So Iceland has normalized the idea that employees typically work 4 days and then have a 3-day weekend every week. Okay, they did a pilot project in 2019, went really well, productivity stayed the same, sometimes improved, well-being definitely improved, and so now they've made it normal in the country. AI is really good at in healthcare with scanning images, radiology images and MRIs, to the point where it can now detect, looking at an image, it can detect various cancers with 95 to 99% accuracy. So did you know that? Have you heard about that? If so, give yourself a little tick. Same with the Iceland one. If you'd heard about that, give yourself a tick. This one here that looks like it says AI with the slopey eye is actually the logo of Anthropic, which is another AI tool. And the CEO of Anthropic, Dario Amodei, was recently quoted as saying that in the next 5 years, AI will replace half of the current entry-level jobs in the world. Okay, if you heard about that, give yourself a tick. I want to stop here and just clarify something here. I've made it really clear that I've used the word current in here. You notice there that I've said it'll replace current jobs. And the reason I'm saying that and really clarifying that is because a lot of the news stories that you heard say AI is going to replace half the jobs and everyone's going to be out of work. It's not true. it's like there will always be entry-level jobs, right? Because by definition, an entry-level job is a job that you do when you finish school or TAFE or uni. It's your first job in the workforce. It's just that what's required of an entry-level job will change. So what's really required is that our education systems prepare people for the first job that they'll get. And as an example, I remember when I became, like, and many people will remember, being an entry-level driver when I was 16, going on 17. I was on my L plates, getting ready for my P plates. And so P plate driver in Australia is kind of an entry-level driver. And when I was studying, I had to learn, as a learner driver, one of the things I had to learn was how to drive a manual car. Most young Australians now don't learn how to drive a manual car because they don't need to, because cars have changed. So that entry-level job, there's still that job of being a P-plate driver, but you don't need, you need different skills now. In a professional role, you might think of lawyers. The entry-level job for a lawyer might be a paralegal, and that involves doing a lot of researching, combining information, and AI actually does a lot of that now. So the entry-level job for a lawyer, a graduate lawyer now, you don't need to know those skills, but maybe you need other skills, whether you call it paralegal or not. Okay, so sort of a bit of a tangent, but I want to make it really clear that what we need is education, preparing people for a different kind of workforce. Anyway, if you heard about that from Anthropic, then give yourself a tick. Here's something happening in the USA at the moment. We see a lot of things happening, and they seem like they're really crazy, outrageous things that are happening. But actually, all of this was not just predicted, but there's a blueprint for what's happening in the USA now, brought to you by the Republican, conservative, right side of politics. And it's called Project 2025. If you've heard of Project 2025, give yourself a tick. This is public. It's not a secret dossier. It was public even before the presidential elections in the US, and it outlined the sort of things that we're seeing, like withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, withdrawing from the World Health Organization, removing diversity, equity and inclusion initiatives in the USA. So this is something that was planned by the Republicans, who now control, of course, the government in the USA. There's a Project 2025 tracker if you're interested in what is yet to come and you want to know what's going to happen in the US in the next months and years. Then at the moment, I took this screenshot a couple of days ago. They're about halfway there at the moment. So there's a map for it. And so this is the sort of thing that we should be doing for understanding about the future. It's not completely out of the blue that things are happening. Some of them are. So here's one. You don't have to, I'm not asking you to give a tick for this, but like a month ago, the president of the USA launched his own perfumes and colognes. So, like a year ago, it would have been bizarre to think that the leader of any democratic country would be using their office for commercial gain, but now that's already happening. Okay, you don't have to give yourself a tick for that one. I just thought that one was quite interesting to see how attitudes have changed so quickly and what's being considered as something that a president can do. Okay, here's one if you haven't heard about Project Esther. If you have heard of it, give yourself a tick. So this is one, it's not from Israel actually, it's from the same people who brought you Project 2025. It's an American project to advance Israeli interests in the world. So like we can talk about what's happening now with genocide in Gaza, with starvation, the Israeli government starving children in Palestine. But Project Esther is, if you want to use the word propaganda, it's a propaganda project to talk about, to make talking about things like that seem anti-Semitic and racist. So again, if you want to find out about it, it's a public project. You can just Google it and find out all the details there. And it's not just happening in the USA. We're seeing parts of this in Australia as well. There's a report currently being reviewed by the Australian government, which they commissioned, which is taking elements of that Project Esther playbook. So if you've heard of Project Esther, or you've heard about closer to home, the Australian government's reviewing this report, then give yourself a tick for that one. Okay, so let's look at some more positive things. If you've attended any of my keynotes, you might have seen me talk about this. It's a little part of the map of the world that if you look at this green circle here, half of the world's population lives inside that circle. Okay, so we're very much in what's going to be the Asian century, and for us in Australia, it gives us huge opportunities as well. But this is where economic power, people power is centered now and in the foreseeable future. If you knew that, give yourself a tick. Couple of consequences of that. So the biggest producer of renewables in the world is China. If you knew that, give yourself a tick. The largest clean energy plant in the world is in India. If you knew that, give yourself a tick. Here's something from one of the more the Western countries. In Paris, there are now more cyclists than motorists who commute to the city centre every day. And this is because of the work of the mayor of Paris, and she's been very progressive and really pushing for reducing carbon emissions in Paris. So as a result of that, we've now got to the point where there are now more cyclists than motorists commuting in Paris. If you knew that, give yourself a tick. Here's another one around, we see a lot of talk about immigration and asylum seekers and refugees, and if I asked you to guess which country has the highest intake of refugees in the world, I wonder whether you know that is Iran. So we hear a lot of negative stories about Iran and how it's a nuclear danger to the world, and that all may be true, but it's also the most compassionate country in the world when it comes to taking in refugees from elsewhere. If you knew that, give yourself a tick. Okay, so that's 10. 11 if you want to count the one about Trump's perfumes. But now let me ask you, and let me bring this up here so we can see the results as well as they come through. How many of those 10 did you get? What was your score? As I said, it's not scientific, but I'm just curious to know where you are in the room. Okay, good to see. Yeah, right. So we're kind of 4 or 5. As I said, the idea is not that these are the most important things, but the point I'm making is that in a really, really connected world, most of those things, I'm not going to say all of those things, but most of those things could have an impact on us, regardless of our industry and sector. Now, if I'm doing the Future Scenarios program for an organization, I do some of this research and talk about more specific things that are relevant to them. But equally, it's useful to go really broad first, because you never know which of those things are going to have an impact. And we'll talk very soon about how you narrow it down. But just be aware that there are things way outside in business, organization, industry and sector, and even country, which are going to have an impact on us now. Okay, and that might sound obvious now, especially in the post-COVID world where we saw a little virus spread through the whole world, but we're seeing things that are going to affect us all more and more. Okay, so the reason I did that little exercise is, again, not to educate you about what's happening in the world, but just to get you thinking broader, thinking more widely. If you want to follow me and see some of the things that I'm sharing and that I'm learning about as a futurist and sharing, follow me on Instagram, because you'll see every day I post something that's changing the world. It's called Better with the hashtag Better World. So follow me on Instagram, and of course follow other sources as well to make sure you know what's happening in the world. I promised that I'd tell you about AI and show you about using AI to do some of this research, and it was really pleasing to see that there's so many people already doing that. So let me talk through a scenario, and I'll do a live demo of using AI for this, because I think this is something that AI has been around now, the generative AI, for the last 3 years now. And I think it's something that many people aren't using it for in terms of scenario planning. Of course, you're using it for writing better emails and writing reports and things, but not a lot of people, in my experience so far, are using it for this kind of research. So let me give you an example. This is a real example. This is something that came up in my family. So my niece Abby is 20, and we were having a family lunch one time, and her boyfriend, who's studying economics at the University of Western Australia, he asked me for how I could help him with AI to answer this question that his lecturer gave him. So the question that they had to write an essay for was this one here. If the Australian government puts all their forces and support behind EVs, will that help or harm the environment? Really good, right? Provocative, challenging question. And his lecturer had told them, you're absolutely allowed to use AI as much as you like in answering the question, and just make sure at the end you tell me how you used it. Okay, which is really exactly what we should be educating students to be doing, to use AI to help them formulate the answer. Okay, so let me switch to this. So first of all, the most obvious thing to do, and Noah said that most of the students in his class, basically what they did was they just did a copy and paste of the question and they put it into ChatGPT and saw what answer they got. And by the way, I did this a couple of days ago, and ChatGPT has actually got a lot more sophisticated in the last year, which is when we had this conversation. And it's actually quite good now. Just giving it a broad question like this is pretty good. Okay, it's not a silver bullet, and even without asking, it's given us pros and cons. Okay, so I'm going to ask you, if you were using AI to answer that question, so will Australian government support for EVs help or harm the environment? Just broadly, I'm not going to expecting you to write full AI prompts, but just in the chat, what would you do? What sort of prompts might you ask? What sort of track would you take when you're looking at answering the question? So I'll go back here and ask you to type in the chat. So what sort of things would you do apart from just copy and paste? Okay. While you're thinking, I'll give you a suggestion that I gave to Noah at the time. So at the time I said, okay, Noah, let's do these two prompts. One is, give me 20 reasons why supporting EVs will harm the environment, and then give me 20 reasons why it will help. And then he could go through those, and he could find out, then research. So using it for idea generation. Okay. Data comparison, yeah. Questions around dependencies, risks, and scenarios. Yep, break-even points. Yeah, the processes. Rebecca says, what are the references? So make sure you get references. Absolutely, you should always do that. And life cycle, yeah. Kate says, yeah, so not just give us a list, but also do some importance rating. Explore the broader definition of environment. Suggest EV components. Yes, okay, good. Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, and really good suggestions here. Good, right? So we can use AI at different levels to address this question. And I can see some people in the room here have actually gone quite deep with that, which is exactly right. Like if you're doing this in a real situation, as opposed to being a university student doing this for an assignment, then you would go quite deep in some of these things here. We actually did another thing as well. Let me just do this shortcut ready for you. Here's another one that I suggested to know how to do. Imagine that you're a time traveler from 2050 and you're coming to talk to the UN about the effects of government support for EVs around the world. And we said, look, especially negative effects. right? And we said, let's try that. Let's ask AI to be speculative, and it did that. So this way, you're looking at, like people say, you don't want AI to make up stuff. In this case, we do. And then, okay, so it's actually written out a speech for us here, and said, yeah, well, this is what we overlooked. And there's a yeah, okay, so here we go. So ChatGPT said the big thing that we missed is not about cars, it's about mobility. Okay, and that's a pretty good big picture way of thinking about whether you support EVs or not. It's like saying you're thinking too small. And then it went into more details. Okay, so my point is this: when you're doing your research using AI for this, you can, like, it's very easy now to do this kind of speculative research and speculative ideas generation rather than just get facts. So one of the things I would say is that most of the responses that I got from the room here were about facts, find out information about break-even points and costs and what's happening in the world and resource acquisition and so on. That's good, and AI is really good for that. But it's also, when you're doing things like scenario planning, AI is really powerful for being speculative. Okay, let me see if I did this other one. I can't remember whether I did. Okay, so we then said to ChatGPT, in that time leading up to 2050, who were the people who warned us about this and we just didn't listen? Okay, and again, it's making up stuff, but we're asking it to talk about real people. Okay, and again, this is really valuable so you can obviously translate this to the way that you would do it. Here are real people that if this was an important issue for you in your sector, AI has now given us a list of people and organizations to follow. Okay? And these are the sort of people you should be thinking about following for the future. Okay. Okay, so I hope that's useful for you. So if you found that useful, can I invite you to do this kind of research is really worth doing beyond just fact gathering. Okay, so if you're doing scenario planning, remember part of it is being speculative about the future, and AI is really good for that. Okay, it's really good for that. If you haven't used that in that way already, then can I please invite you to do that. Okay, so let me just quickly check for questions and comments while we're waiting. So Steve says very useful. Ross says love it. Yeah, Nikki says yes, good tip. Yeah, thank you. Thanks. As I said, it's an area that I think most people don't think of using it this way, and it's absolutely something that you should do. Okay. So, the other thing that you can do with AI, and we haven't got the time to go through this in detail, is many of the AI tools now have a facility called Deep Research. Can I ask, just in the room here, how many people have used Deep Research? Can you just say yes if you've already using it? The Deep Research tools, which are built into Copilot, they've built into ChatGPT, Perplexity. So the main AI tools have this now. Copilot, you need to have it switched on by your IT team, but it is there. Okay, so hardly any is, and it's not surprising because it's fairly new. And what Deep Research allows you to do is, rather than just ask a simple query, you can ask AI to go off and do research for you, and it'll research various sources and come back to you with an answer. There are particular techniques to use to do this, but it's really valuable when you're doing this scanning. So for example, now with many of my clients, when I'm speaking at their conferences, I'm speaking at the Bus Industry Confederation conference in November and October, and I don't want to be sharing stats and data and lots of boring information in a keynote presentation, but I've got for the delegates a report that I've compiled, which is AI assisted, not obviously with anything. You don't just ask AI to do it and then just publish, but I used Deep Research the AI deep research to do a lot of research behind the report. Speaking to an education conference coming up in September, I've done the same thing. So all of that now is available at our fingertips if we know how to use it. So if you already don't know how to use deep research, please have a look at it. And if you want help, engage me to help your leadership team with that as well. Okay, so let me stop and just see if there are questions and comments before we proceed. If you're looking at the time, time's good actually, because I want to spend most of our time looking at the scanning, and then I'll give you a method of narrowing it down and a suggestion for taking action. So we spent most of our time in the first area, which is exactly right. But let me just check if there are questions or comments about the process that of scanning the environment with AI or other ways of doing it. And can I add, one thing I haven't mentioned when you're scanning is make sure that you involve your team in this as well. So I'm presenting this as if it's for you as a leader, leaders, managers, senior leaders to do the scanning, but make sure you involve your team as well, because they've got valuable insights and perspectives that are different from yours. And everybody should be a futurist in this respect. Many of them already are, and they've already got ideas about how the world's changing and how it's going to keep changing. So make sure you've got some process to involve them as well. Okay, let me continue then. Good. So the second area here, there's a lot of things that we can talk about in processes to narrow this down, to narrow and make better decisions by narrowing things down. I'm going to give you two very simple ideas here. I think we've now got 14 techniques that I go through in the program, but I'll show you two of them here. And I picked these two because these are two that you can do immediately. So the goal here now is you've identified some scenarios that might be relevant for you. And I like this quote by Thoreau, who said, "Our life is frittered away by detail. Simplify, simplify." You could probably have just got away with one simplify here. But the point is this: we've got so many plausible scenarios. How do we find the ones to work on? Here's a comment from somebody who said, when I asked about biggest challenges, so Glynis, who is here on the line today, in the room, she said the biggest challenge is understanding what AI can do to improve customer experience, make life easier, so we can focus on future projects. So I'm not going to talk about that in detail here, but the last presentation that I did, the last online one, was exactly about this, AI for customer experience. And so you can go to my website and watch the recording of that. The thing I want to highlight about this comment is it's exactly the right focus. So if you have one of the techniques for narrowing down is to focus on customer experience or customer, what you're doing for solving customer problems, whether you call them customers, clients, shareholders, external stakeholders. When you're narrowing down your scenarios, one way to do it is to look at the ones that are going to have an impact on our customers and put them in the keep file for now rather than discarding them. Okay, so that's the first thing. And I'm not spending a lot of time on this, but it's one of the best things that you can do. Especially if you're a commercial organization, look at what it means for your customers. If you want the recording of the last presentation that I did, it's at gihanperera.com. And also, in the last couple of weeks, I've launched a new report that I've written called AI-Powered Customer Experience. It's also on the website, but let me just type in the chat. Okay, actually I won't type in the chat just yet, but you can go to the website and you can download that report. Okay, it's free. It's a really good read. And as Steve, who's here, said, this is a seriously good read because I sent it out to some of the other people who registered as well. Okay, so that's the first thing to do. One of the ways to narrow it down. And here's another one which most futurists won't talk about, but I think it's really, really useful because it's very easy to do this kind of future scenarios planning in theory and at a strategic offsite, and then maybe put things into your strategic plan, and then you think you're done. But it's not, because you need people you need your team to actually implement and work through these scenarios. So one of the things that I think is really important to do is, when you're looking at these plausible scenarios, there may be something that you're excited about, and that's good, but also ask yourself the question, who in your team is going to be the champion for that particular scenario? So if you're thinking about something like EVs, I'll pick that example because we've been talking about it. If you're thinking about the impact of EVs, is there somebody in your team who's really excited and enthusiastic about that and is going to be the champion of following that scenario through, either implementing it or staying on top of it, and subscribes to blogs and goes to conference and interested in going to conferences and follows futurists on Instagram about EVs and is always annoying you about that? So when you go through your scenarios, I recommend that you classify them as A, B, or C. A, if you've got somebody you know is going to be championing it. They're really, really interested and excited in it. B is if you go, well, there's somebody I might have in mind, but I need to talk to her about it to see if she's willing to take it on. Then that might be a B. And C is almost like see you later, and there's no one who's really interested in that. So unless it's a really important scenario, let's actually put that one on the back burner. Let's discard that one. Okay, so I'm trying to give you a pragmatic view of that as well. It's very easy to look at the scenarios and say, oh, net zero 2035 is our target, and so we have to focus on that. And if it absolutely is, then do. But also, a lot of really good initiatives fall by the wayside because there isn't somebody to champion it. Okay, so really important that you, whatever you choose, you're going to have somebody to take that out of your future scenarios program, out of your strategic planning. Otherwise, it's pretty hard for you to do it yourself. Okay, any questions about that or comments about that? As I said, like often this wasn't part of the original scenario planning from Shell, but this is one of the most important things. If you want to actually make things happen, then you don't just want a futurist who comes in and helps you with all of this and then says, okay, it's out of my hands now, it's over to you. Part of the process is identifying who's going to do it. Okay. And a comment from Ron from earlier about identifying the contrary voices. Like that's really good, right? Like if you've got something in mind and you think you want to go ahead with a plan, or you think that a scenario is really important to us, then this is going back to the whole using AI to find the positives and the negatives. And you should do this. This is how you test an idea. Right? You don't just continue looking for confirming evidence. What you look for is a way to falsify or to the contrarian view. Okay, it's a scientific process. So scientists come up with something and then they find a way that they could be wrong if they're doing science right, and we should be doing the same with our planning as well. Okay, so let's do the third area here. And the third part of it is now that you've identified the scenarios that you're going to work with, and you've narrowed down the ones that you think are the most important to you, how do you include them in your planning? So again, I'm going to give you a really practical way of doing this, especially for the scenarios that you're not exactly sure what they're going to look like, because we've done the scan and we've narrowed it down. So now we want to create a plan for it. Okay, but some of the scenarios are going to happen, so you can plan for them, and some of them are still too uncertain to put into your strategic plan. Okay, I want to share with you two things that people said to me beforehand when I asked about challenges. They're two very different things, but I'm going to use them to lead into your action. So one from Sarah, she said, how can we remain forward-thinking and agile and not over-engineer? So Sarah's challenge that they're having in their organization is that there are so many things that we can do, and we don't want to go down too many false paths. I think Sarah, that's what you're after. Catherine, on the other hand, has kind of got the opposite issue that she's facing in her organization, where she says we've got so many things happening outside that we need to be aware of, but we work in a very slow changing, risk-averse organization. So how do we make those things happen? Okay, can you see they're almost the opposite? One is we're going too fast, the other one's we're going too slow. Now, can I make a suggestion here? And there are two ways that you can look at these scenarios. There's some that you can act on now, because you know what the scenario is going to look like. You know roughly what the scenario is going to look like. And if you don't, and this is particularly in the case where you've got a risk-averse organization, or you don't necessarily have the authority to implement the full action plan, then my suggestion is you pick a small version of it. It may even be a pilot project or a prototype that you experiment with to see what the effect is. So if you do that kind of experiment, it's going to take you closer to where you want to be, even if it may not solve it completely. Okay, so if you can, find a way to act on something now. Okay, and it'll either help you get more clarity, or you might find that it fails, and that gives you clarity as well. Okay, whether or not it succeeds or fails, experiments have an outcome, which is you know more than when you started. Again, I find my experience with working with leaders, it's quite often when they identify scenarios, many of them seem too big to take action. So the thing to do is to do a small mini project. I don't just mean get started on the whole initiative, but do a little mini project, a case study, a pilot project, a prototype. Try it out with a few customers and see what their feedback is. So get started that way, to act now. The other thing that you can do is, if you really don't know what that scenario is going to look like in the future, but you know that it might be important for us to keep tracking, don't let it fall off the priority list, but keep it to monitor and track it regularly. Okay, so there may be things that you'll see like again, sustainability or global conflict, and you think that might affect us because it'll affect, like if there's war in the Middle East, and it's going to affect a number of things in Australia, including things that take a commercial view around supply chain disruption, and you want to keep track of it, then make sure you've got a process for keeping track of it. And I reckon there are three parts to this. So one is identify what events will change your plan. So what's going to happen that's going to change it? So it could be Trump imposing higher tariffs is going to change our plan because it's going to affect our exports to the US, for example. So you're looking out for that to happen. Okay, so that could be a trigger event. Then the next thing you want to do is know where you're going to look for that information. So where are you going to get your intelligence from? How regularly are you going to be subscribing to things, watching news, attending conferences, so that you can continue to get this intelligence. And the last part of it, which is just as important as the other two, is who is going to be in charge of that. And again, as I said earlier, if you've got somebody who's on that ABC scale, they're an A, and you go, we love this is what we want to do, then you've obviously got somebody responsible for that. But even if it's somebody who's a B, that's okay. Okay, but have somebody to do that. Let me give you a quick example. I was working with the board of an organization in regional Australia, and we did this whole future scenarios program. And at the end of it, they identified 4 scenarios that they thought were the most important ones that they needed to address in their regional area. And so what they decided to do, and I'm giving this to you as an example of how you might implement this monitoring and tracking, is they had 4 volunteers, 4 of the board members volunteered, and each of them volunteered to be the champion for one of those 4 scenarios. And so what they would do is, in addition to whatever else they were doing, whenever they saw something that was interesting, they would share it on the board WhatsApp chat group. Also, at every monthly board meeting, 3 of the 4 would give a 5-minute update to the rest of the board about their particular scenario, and the 4th one would give a 30-minute update. So they got the time, they got the opportunity to do the full the bigger version, and that rotated through the month by month. Different people got the chance to do the 30-minute presentation. So what it meant was the board every month was getting an update on the 4 scenarios, and 3 times a year they would get an in-depth update on each of those scenarios. So that's the process that they put into place for tracking the scenarios which weren't on their strategic plan, but they needed to keep an eye on and not forget about. Okay, so what's your process around that? Okay, I am now going to just quickly check if there are any other questions or comments or chat. So yes, a comment from Ron is it critical for the organization to adapt to changes that are foreseen and not foreseen. Exactly. And this coming back to that idea of let me do that, because we've come to we've covered all 3 of them now, but if you come back to the idea of the future of work, so we've talked about this assessing today. We spent all our time doing that, most of the time in scanning, but also if you do look down at the bottom right there, the adapt one is having that culture. So it's again responsibility as leaders to build a culture that's open to and embracing change. Okay, so we're right on time. If you want to know more about engaging me to do this, either doing a keynote presentation at your conference about seeing into the future, or whether you'd like me to run your future scenarios program for you and your leadership team, love to have a chat. You'll find all of that at gihanperera.com. I'm going to finish with this quotation from Benjamin Brewster in the late 1800s, and he said, in theory there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. So I hope you've got some ideas in theory that you can take away and use, and please put them into practice sooner rather than later, because you'll get so much value from actually doing it now rather than just having the ideas, putting them on the back burner. So try them, even if they're really simple things. Just try them out. Go to AI and try some of the stuff that we did today, or do something else from what you've learned. Thanks everyone. My last message to you: don't wait for the world to be ready for you, because it won't. It's moving really fast, so start before you're ready. And thanks everyone, and I'll see you in the future. Bye for now.